Great. So, terrific. Thank you. So I just want to say welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, especially Emily, for being here. Y'all, just as an administrative things, if everyone will please keep your microphone on mute until you are ready to speak, it'll just cut down on background noise. For anyone who's called in by phone, you can mute your phone using the buttons *4. Yeah, and for those of you who don't know me, my name is Liz Burlingame. I'm the state chapter leader here at ME Action Georgia. And the reason I wanted Emily to come speak specifically to our group today is because as a long-term patient with ME, I have watched Emily and her team at Solve help us create ways to become better advocates. And there's no better example of that than the Advocacy Day, which is an annual event, which has now become an Advocacy Week. And as of last year, Emily and her team at Solve devised a way to make the program entirely virtual. And this just played to our strengths because it allowed so many of us to speak to our congressional representatives from our beds, which many of us did. And I'm seeing here in Georgia more and more people who want to participate. And particularly last year, there were 3 people in particular that I can think of who told their stories for the first time. And at least 2 of them got back to me after the advocacy days and said that they had found their voice and they felt inspired. And I was inspired by that. And I feel like there's just nothing better that we can give one another than a sense of empowerment. And Emily Taylor and the team at Solve are giving us a way to make our voices truly heard. So I just thank you, Emily, for being here. I think Emily is going to give a presentation and then there will be time at the end for Q&A. So if anyone has specific questions for Emily, you will have that opportunity at the end of the meeting. So with that in mind, thank you again, Emily, for being here. I'll let you introduce yourself, but welcome, Emily Taylor.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you to jazz hands for the quiet applause to all of the ME Action Georgia team. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you reaching out, and it's my pleasure to walk you through a little bit more about what we're doing this year for Advocacy Day and why, and some tips and tricks about how you can do some really effective, amazing advocacy work from home. For some of you all, I know this might be a bit of a repeat since you're all veterans who've done this a couple of times now. This is our 5th year now for Advocacy Week. So some of this might sound a little familiar for some of you, but hopefully for the new folks, this will be really helpful. And I'll try to save as much time as a Q&A at the end so we can really dive into how you can make this your own. And so the one thing I'd like to say before we get started, well, first I should introduce myself. Hello, for the new faces I'm not familiar with. My name is Emily Taylor. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Community Relations for the Solve ME CFS Initiative. Our former CEO and President, Carol Head, hired me about 5 years ago to start a federal affairs program for ME CFS, and I've been thrilled at the progress we've made so far. One of the capstone events that we've initiated has been, as your great leader so wonderfully described, our ME CFS Advocacy Week. Last year, we had quite the adventure where we, in fewer than 6 weeks, translated an entire in-person event into a virtual event. And we had some lessons that we learned. So hopefully we're a lot better situated this year. And for those of you who are wondering, well, why didn't you always do it virtually? The answer to that question is we will now. So now that we've proven that it can work and that it can be effective, it definitely was not a common practice prior to COVID-19. It was sort of, everyone was told, and this was sort of the standard across all of the advocacy folks in the professional space, that, you go and meet with people in person. That's the best way to make an impact. And we did that for 3 years and we were really effective. And then COVID hit. And we found that we can be just as effective if we use mobile digital platforms to bring our homebound and bedbound community members to Capitol Hill virtually. And really, it just was on Capitol Hill to accept virtual meetings, which they're now doing. So I really don't anticipate that we'll ever go back to a purely in-person model ever again, because again, the amazing access that this has created for our community. And it was so hard, as many of you know, There were folks who just, the last minute day of, they were trying to get on a plane and were too sick and couldn't make their flight. And so we did a lot of scrambling in person to try to ensure all of our meetings were covered. And digitally, we can do that with even more effectiveness. And again, it was really the stance of most of these offices that they wouldn't accept digital meetings, and that has been proven to no longer be the case. So for those of you looking about the future, where we go from here, we can say that with confidence that we'll always keep to a digital platform in some respects. I'll start kind of at the big picture, and then I'll zero down into exactly how the Emmy team in Georgia can make a big difference. First of all, Georgia has really proven that small groups of people working together can completely change the outcomes of the electoral process. So first of all, kudos to Georgia, for just being one of the most amazing steps of voter enrollment and voter turnout and voter outreach. Georgia is really showing that it's democracy at its finest that gets these things done. And so how can we use our democratic processes as a community to get action for MECFS? So last year for Advocacy Day, we were very quick to transform our efforts into the long COVID messaging. At that time, we didn't have the data that we have now, so we were in more of a little bit of a crystal ball as we were going to Capitol Hill and predicting some of these outcomes, but we were predicting the outcomes that would be exactly what we ended up seeing. We predicted that a significant subset of people with long COVID-like symptoms would end up being diagnosed with MECFS. That's coming to pass. We anticipated that these long COVID symptoms would most likely affect women if they were mirroring what MECFS does, and that has also come to pass. We also predicted that there would be a lack of infrastructure and a lack of complex chronic illness care providers to be able to absorb this new budding population, which unfortunately also did come to pass. And so a lot of what we do on Capitol Hill is one part messaging and storytelling to really demonstrate these issues. And so when I described these three things that came to pass, when we went to Capitol Hill, for those of you who participated last year, you may remember that we were very careful in our messaging, and we trained you to be very, with that wording. Now we can kind of be a little bit less careful, because as we all have seen, all of these things have come to pass, and the data is stronger with us now. So for those of you who are joining us again from last year, a lot of those talking points you can just reuse this year, but with a bit more gusto, because we know that's happening. So last year, our big asks were largely around our bill, which we got the very first bill for MECFS ever introduced in the United States. It was called HR 7057, which our bill number. The name of the bill was the Understanding COVID-19 Subsets and MECFS. It was a very small bill. It was only $15 million, but it was trying to get an extra supplemental award with just that money, just for this overlap between MECFS and long COVID. And this was introduced all the way back. We had this language in February of last year. As the pandemic progressed and as 2020 progressed and a lot of new information and new data became available, we saw very quickly that HR 7057 got a lot of interest. We had 50 co-sponsors. Again, that's huge numbers of support. But it was very clear that this was not the scope we needed. And because it was such a small attempt at that very early stage, it really didn't fit what we needed and didn't have a home. So as we worked from Advocacy Day in April last year and continuing through the end of the year, pushing for this bill to get passed, we ended up moving away from it. First, because it was too small, and especially because the crisis was growing at such large proportions. And also because it became clear that we no longer needed to segment MECFS and long COVID as two separate researchable areas that were related. As we hit the end of last year, especially with the Hannah Davis study that came out at the end of the year, it became very clear that this was not a, can we get some money to study the association? It was, these are the same things, and we are in a public health crisis. Alarm klaxons should be ringing. So you could see our messaging throughout the year evolve as the science and the connection between long COVID and MECFS became clearer and clearer. And you could see us start out very cautiously, 15 million, we think there's a connection, we'd like to study it. And that language in April, you guys, we anticipate, we estimate all that soft language from last year, whereas now we are at full on, this is a public health crisis. We are not equipped to handle it, and we absolutely need emergency supplemental funding now. And you can see that evolution of soft language to more urgent alarm klaxon language come over time. So that brings us to the end of last year when we converted HR 7057 into another appropriations request. This one was for 100 million for the rapid acceleration of diagnostics. And you see that that language did end up in the final bill, along with another $1 billion that we didn't anticipate and didn't specifically ask for, but are thrilled to have received. We now know in retrospect that we were not the only ones saying that this was really important, but we sort of paved the way because the one who was the single entity that was the most loud and clear about the long COVID crisis was actually the NIH. So us paving the way really helped the NIH actually succeed in their advocacy internally to get that $1 billion. So it was really all part of the same issue. So now that stands, and again, $1 billion for long COVID is amazing, and we are absolutely thrilled. And it is singly the largest financial resource opportunity for MECFS that I have seen ever since I worked here. And but that doesn't mean we're done. We can't just be like, we got $1 billion. Oh, we're all set. Unfortunately, this is where part two of the advocacy comes in, is now that it's at the NIH, we need to focus at the NIH and make sure that this money is being used in ways that we think are effective, that we know will help more patients, and are not recreating the wheel. I mean, what if we spend the first 2 years of this 3-year opportunity with this money, the $1 billion from NIH, and we spend those first 2 years doing exactly what we already did with MECFS, building collaborative research centers, which here we are 4 years into the collaborative research centers, and we're still much slower than we hope to be. Can you imagine how much time and how much pain and suffering would be created if we allowed the NIH to just recreate the wheel, start all over again, and make that slow progress? So that brings us to part one of our 3-part advocacy strategy this year, which I see these as lines that are parallel, that are all heading to the same destination, and we need to make sure all 3 trains are rolling as fast as we can down all these 3 parallel tracks. So the first track is the NIH track. And this is the track where we've really leaned into collaborative partnerships by forming the Long COVID Alliance. And this first track is focused exclusively on NIH and that $1 billion. The goal of this track is to be effective partners, strong advocates within the NIH to best educate the NIH and support MECFS or post-infectious disease modeling and research that we think is going to find answers for both long COVID and MECFS. And we recognize that we can't do this alone, that long COVID has touched a lot of different disease spaces, not just MECFS, the most prominent of which is dysautonomia, specifically POTS, or post-orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. As many of you know, this is a common occurrence with people with MECFS. Most people with MECFS experience dysautonomia symptoms or POTS-like symptoms. They're basically interwoven at this point. So how do you distinguish if a long COVID patient is having MECFS symptoms or POTS symptoms? We need the research. And again, all of this I think is really going to pull together. So, so the Long COVID Alliance, we're now up to over 150 folks who have signed up, 75 individuals and over 50 organizations that are all coming together with the single goal of leveraging our existing knowledge and advocating for long COVID research that is going to focus on this post-infectious neuroimmune interaction, which, and the reason why I felt to take a moment longer to explain why I have to make that distinction. The words that Congress wrote in the bill for this $1 billion, and this is something that the ME community was very aware of and pushed back on a lot, were very vague. And that was at the request of the NIH. The NIH wanted the flexibility to study a lot of different areas. So the actual terminology in the bill says $1.15 billion to study long-term COVID-19 outcomes and effects, or something that I'm paraphrasing, but it's long-term COVID-19 outcomes, which is not specifically long COVID. We knew immediately that there's different flavors of long COVID, if you will. There are folks who have been in the ICU who are experiencing post-ICU syndrome. There are folks who survived, whether on an incubator or not, who have permanent lung and heart and kidney scarring. That's all very painful and awful, but that's not, as you know, what we consider and what the NIH has now also confirmed what they consider long COVID. We consider long COVID, and the NIH has also used the term post-acute COVID-19 syndrome, or PACS. And that is zeroing in specifically to the cornucopia of symptoms that accompany a post-infection neuroimmune dysregulation response, which we still don't really have a name for it. I often use the term syndrome soup, because it's sort of as many of you know, you probably have multiple diagnoses of the syndrome soup that they're all just kind of conflated together. And the way I've been describing this to legislators in the last few weeks is, this syndrome soup is something that was never a public health crisis because it was always pockets and small amounts of people getting sick. It was never one massive group of people all entering the soup at the same time. So we have infrastructure that's woefully inadequate just to help take care of people in the soup. And now the soup just got 3 times as big. And now when we already had, major medical providers with 4-year waiting lists and, no insurance coverage and no FDA approved treatment for half of these different syndromes. So that was really what brought us together to the Long COVID Alliance, why we chose to bring on so many partners to try to widen this effort to really keep the NIH focused on the areas that we see will be effective. So that's track one. This is not to be confused or not to pull away from track two. Track two is really where Advocacy Day is going to focus this year. So track two is a different yet aligned messaging. The messaging behind Advocacy Track 2 is specifically to Congress. So Track 1 is really focusing on NIH, and Track 2 is specifically focusing on Congress. Track 2, the messaging goes something like this. Dear Congress, you gave $1.15 billion to NIH, and that's wonderful, and they really need it, and this issue really needs a comprehensive federal response. And while we are so grateful for the money you gave to NIH, we realize that this is not a comprehensive federal response. Congress needs to do 3 things in order to fully and holistically take a 360 approach to this long COVID public health crisis. You have to fund research, got that one down, good job, but you also need to fund medical education, and you also need to ensure there's access to care. These other 2 areas, these other 2 what I'm calling legs of the stool, if you have a 3-legged stool, that represents federal response to long COVID, these other 2 legs have been completely unaddressed. And Congress, you're walking around with a 1-legged stool and you're going to get somebody hurt if you try to sit on it. So that's the message to Congress, is that these other 2 legs of the stool, medical education and access to care, also need investments in funding. And so to that end, we've pitched 8 different appropriations requests to the Hill this year. We're hoping to not focus our appropriations request as the main ask of Advocacy Day. That's our plan B. What we're hoping to do rather, so this is on track 2, plan B. I know it's got a lot to keep in sorted. Our plan A for track 2 is to have a piece of legislation introduced. It is not going to be the same as HR 7057. It is going to be HR 7057 2.0, or maybe the Phoenix version, it comes back from the dead, of HR 7057, but it's going to be much bigger, much more robust, and it's going to focus on these other 2 legs of the stool, medical education and patient access for quality patient care. We're focusing on 3 agencies in particular. These 3 agencies are the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the primary entity responsible for medical education at the federal level. PCORI, also known as the Patient Centered Outcomes Research Institute, PCORI, PCORI. This agency is not actually technically a government agency, even though it is funded entirely through agency resources. It is an independent nonprofit that focuses on delivering patient-centered research funding, almost like the NIH, but with a different track. We are working with a congressman named Representative Byer, who at the very, very, very end of last session, literally, I think he introduced it on like December 28th, and the session closes on the 31st. So that was obviously no expectation to pass, but at the very end of last session, he introduced a bill called the COVID-19 Long Haulers Act. And he, in this bill, requested $100 million for PCORI to specifically to construct patient registries and harmonize data across multiple platforms. He's a self-described public data health nerd. which makes him aligned with our own hearts at Solve ME. As you know, we have been investing in the first longitudinal data tracking app and registry for ME/CFS called You Plus Me. So we also are big data public health nerds. We believe that data, especially big data, harmonized data that compare across multiple platforms, is going to be our answer to finding out how to get to ME/CFS and cure it. So that's why we very much aligned with Representative Beyer in our souls of public health nerddom. And through this, we have convinced him to reintroduce this bill with a slightly different approach to focus on these two legs of the stool. So he brought to us the PCORI piece of the puzzle. We already had the CDC piece of the puzzle. And then the last piece of this puzzle is an agency called AHRQ, or the Agency for Healthcare Quality and Research. That access question, especially that question about who has access. Does everybody have access? Are there certain groups or geographies or socioeconomic classes, races, ethnicities, genders that are not getting access to care? That's what AHRQ was built to study and why they're excellent at doing. And so that's why they're also focusing on them as part of our response to COVID-19 and specifically to the long haul phenomena. So that roughly outlines track 2, which plan A is to get this piece of legislation. We're still working with Representative Beyer, and fingers crossed we can get that legislation introduced before Advocacy Day. So that'll be our rallying cry. Assuming we are on time and all the pieces come together for track 2. And then if our plan B, if we fail to get the legislation reintroduced in time, will be the appropriations requests. Those appropriations requests, I mentioned there are 8 of them. They total about $180 million, if I remember correctly off the top of my head, in supplemental appropriations for these these other agencies. To round out the investment of NIH. Last but not least, as part of track 2, we are also, you may have heard of our success in the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program, also known as CDMRP. This is like NIH, the SWAT team version. If regular NIH members are sort of like frontline street cops, the DoD program called CDMRP is sort of the SWAT team version of NIH. They go in with really big investments, really, really fast, and then get out again to make big actions. Versus the NIH sort of pumps out regular money as more like a regular street cop, like kind of managing your regular day-to-day health crime. That's a weird example, but stick with me. The SWAT team response, the DoD, we've been successful the last 3 years. ME/CFS has been lobbying to get into that program. We were successful for the first time last year, which resulted in the very first SWAT team style funding to ever go into the ME/CFS community. And that was $500,000, $500,000 that went to Ron Davis and his team. And we're very proud of that. Their grant applications were 2 of 7 compliant applications that were funded, and of 25 applications submitted. So that's something on us as a team that we need to do better at, is teaching our researchers how to use this money or how to apply for funding and be compliant in this new area. But we're doing that again, both for ME/CFS and long COVID. So we have another request for a special, just for this year, $30 million DoD investment in long COVID to do an additional pot of money. The reason why we want this additional pot of money outside of NIH, and this is no disrespect meant to NIH, even though NIH has been historically very slow and trying to find politically correct ways to describe, very slow to come around on ME/CFS. And I know since we got some new program officers, Vicki Whittemore in particular and Joe Breen have been amazing, but their predecessors were definitely not as willing to listen or speak to the ME/CFS population, and I think that was a huge lack. So as you know, and I could go on and on, but I think everyone here understands that, the NIH has its problems. It's not a perfect system. And I think NIH would be the first to say, yes, we're not perfect. We're trying to get better, but we're not perfect. And so the DoD system is very similar to the NIH, except it has a second tier review process. And the second tier review process is why I think the DoD, frankly, does a better job funding research, because they change every year. So they're not just funding the same things over and over. And in addition to that, their second tier review process is not based on scientific merit, but is based on a consumer review panel that looks at real world impacts and impacts to the field. So it's just in the NIH, it's just scientific funding, right? Whatever you score, you're either above the line or you're below the line, you get paid or you don't get paid. That's it. They don't care if this is going to be the single research study that will revolutionize a disease space. Did it get above the line or below the line? That's all NIH does. So this DoD program, I think, is in addition to being rapid response, it's more impactful because it has that second tier of review. So everybody gets the scientific rubber above or below, and after that they say, is this research going to change the field? Is this going to really direct people's lives? What is the impact of this grant? And they get a second review based on how effective the grant will be in making an impact. And that second number is compared with the first number, and then they fund, not just based on the quality of the science, but also based on the impact that research will have. And that's why I'd like to see an additional set of funds for long COVID in the defense program, because that second review process really does make their grant program so much more immediately responsive to the needs of the patients directly. So that's track 2. Very quickly, track 3 is kind of the Solve ME track, if you will. This is a little bit focused on just ME/CFS and what our organization is looking at. And this is specific to our traditional goals that were happening before long COVID happened, regarding data harmonization, increased investment in epidemiology research for ME/CFS. And of course, the one thing we've been calling for many years is a comprehensive national prevalence study on ME/CFS. We've asked for that again this year, except we asked for it to be $10 million, and we asked for it to also include long COVID so that we could start differentiating these groups if there is a difference, or making the point that they are the same and should be treated the same. But without the epidemiology and the prevalence study to really peel that onion, we're not going to know until they do the research. So those are tracks 1, 2, and 3, which is I focused on NIH, long COVID, and ME/CFS respectively. And that second track, the long COVID track, is going to be our focus for Advocacy Day this year. And I know that went longer than I meant to, but I'll zero in now on. Actually, why don't I pause there for questions? And then I can go back and talk about specifically what you can do for your immediate Advocacy Day as part of Track 2's efforts.
Just thank you so much, Emily. That's so encouraging. And I wasn't aware you had 50 organizations now in this Long COVID Alliance. That's huge. I just feel like collaboration is going to take us so much farther, right?
I agree. I think it's really going to be especially meaningful because, it's one thing for the ME/CFS community to acknowledge this connection, right? We've been working here for a long time. We're very familiar with it. But when all the communities come together and in one voice say, this is a research challenge that must be addressed and it needs to be addressed in these ways, then you really get attention paid.
Absolutely. So exciting. Does someone have a question they want to pose to Emily? Go ahead, Mina.
Hey, Emily, this is incredible. It sounds wonderful. What I wanted to ask was the question that comes up a lot in our community, which is how we keep from getting traditional ME/CFS lost in the wide swath of long COVID. And since there's some of us who are not even post-viral, since ME/CFS is not strictly a post-viral disease. I suspect that's your track 3 there, but if you could make it a little more clear as to how we keep from getting overwhelmed by the long COVID train and maybe get lost in the mix.
I could absolutely. Well, let me actually, if I can share my screen really quickly, I can show you a file that might be helpful to explain that. Let me see if I can find this. There we go. Okay, can you see my screen there? Okay, so this is actually the welcome packet for the Alliance members. So any new Long COVID Alliance members who join the coalition get this packet, and this is kind of like a who we are and what we do. So the one thing I wanted to point out to you, this is some statistics about how ME/CFS and long COVID are related. We took out a lot of this, but we know these are the big pull quotes that are really driving people to understand how significant this work is. But let me just, oops, sorry. So these are our basic alliance priority, but here's our goals. So this is what I wanted to show you. This is the goals of the alliance that we've articulated. As you can see, there's two tracks here, track 1 and track 2, exactly as I described to you here. They are aligned with the alliance priorities, and track 3 is obviously ME/CFS specific, and that's something that Solve ME is working on continuously outside of its work with the alliance. But inside the alliance, I just wanted to focus on this track 1 and go into a little bit more detail about where we see this going in the future. These two steps right here are really important. And the reason why I wanted to highlight them is because it's one thing to look at this $1 billion as the windfall it is, but it's another thing to think of this $1 million as the seed funding for what we hope will be a larger research infrastructure in the future. And that's how I'm approaching this funding and how I'm approaching our advocacy work in this area, is that, frankly, long COVID is a news story now, and in 3 years, it's probably going to be forgotten. And in 3 years, these people are probably going to still be sick. And the idea that we approach this $1 billion as a one and done is not, I think, what's going to get us out of the woods. My approach and what we've set up the alliance to do is to look at this $1 billion as seed investment for a future sustainable backbone of infrastructure for research in long COVID and specifically ME/CFS. I would like to see this all to evolve eventually into long COVID, or sorry, centers of excellence that focus on the syndrome soup, that focus on ME/CFS, that focus on dysautonomia, mast cell activation, all these comorbid conditions together. And that's how we're approaching, and the alliance is approaching this money. It's not just to do a bunch of research studies now, even though yes, we do have a lot of research studies we want funded, but we expect this to be a longitudinal investment, that this $1 billion becomes the brick and mortar foundations of a treatment network that will be sustained beyond the immediate crisis, the immediate pandemic response, so that it'll be a permanent treatment network for people like ME/CFS that will hopefully stick around. And that's one of the things I highlighted right here is sustainability. We wanted this to be the first step in a sustainable research and treatment infrastructure that will outlive this current crisis. On the Hill, there's a common saying that says, "Don't let a good crisis go to waste," or "Don't let a good panic go to waste." That's a little bit like the approach we're taking. We're using long COVID now to make the point to legitimize ME/CFS, to highlight the overlap of these illnesses. Long COVID, frankly, is not going to go away just because we beat the pandemic. There are still people who are going to be sick, and unless we find somehow a magic mystery cure in the next 3 years, which is possible, fingers crossed, who knows? We managed to pull a vaccine together in less than 8 months, so clearly it's possible. But assuming that, it's like plan for the best, or, hope for the best, but plan for the worst. Hoping that we do find in this $1 billion an immediate one-stop solution. If that doesn't happen, this $1 billion will be there for a long-term treatment center and research center backbone that will stay as our patients are going to stay, not just because the news cycle moves on. So I hope that was about maybe a little bit longer than you expected. I hope that answers your question, Wilhelmina.
That was good. Yes, loved it.
Wonderful. Were there any other questions? Because I didn't want to take up too much. I wanted to leave us more time at the end for the one-on-one questions. All right, moving on. Sorry, Elizabeth.
Yes, just quickly, Emily, thank you so much for all of that explanation. Well, how does your Solve registry get used with all of this developing interest in research?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking. There's been definitely a lot of interest in the registry. What we have operationalized right now are 3 things. The patient registry itself, which has now been expanded to accept patients with long COVID and other overlapping illnesses as well. We've been using the term non-ME/CFS control or volunteer control as opposed to healthy control. So we're trying to build out robust sets of comparison groups that are sex and age matched. So that's another thing that's been a lot in demand that researchers have been having trouble doing is if you're going to look at a 27-year-old ME/CFS patient, you need a matching 27-year-old long COVID patient with like a similar lifestyle or or even similar geographic area. So that's what one thing we're doing is doing robust patient matching. That's one element. Second is obviously the long COVID study we're running. If you haven't already heard of it, highly recommend. It's on our website. We're using the long COVID cohort that's been entered into the registry to run some data sets, basically comparing key markers of ME/CFS with long COVID patients to further create data to make the evidence that these are related and connected. And then third, which has been, I think, really of the most interest to a lot of our partners, is our longitudinal data tracking app, which is, for those of you who haven't tried it out yet, if you register on the registry, fill out your initial entry forms with your initial entry surveys. It takes about, I did it for my mom and I'm healthy-ish, and it took me about 45 minutes. I would say probably plan for like an hour to an hour and a half, depending on how bad your brain fog is, to get through all of the questionnaire. But once you get through the questionnaire, you'll get a link to sign up for the app. And then the app, it downloads on your phone, it pops up every 3 days, and it just tracks once you fill out all that data. It takes all the data from the surveys you filled out and creates a customized symptom tracking for you. And it identifies your top 3 symptoms with a scale that you can just slide up or slide down on how bad they've been, and then asks you a couple questions. And again, I think the push notification is about 5 minutes every 3 days to fill out. And it's designed to be really low impact for people who are having energy crashes. And it basically tracks your main symptoms over time and asks you basic questions like how many hours were your feet on the floor? Did you have any precipitating exposures or events that might have led to a crash? If you report that you're crashing, it'll go back and check your logs from before to see if you did something and then they'll help you alert to something that might have caused your crash. And they're working on, they being our research team, is able to pull out all this data from your app and get it to your doctor as well. So that's really helpful. And I've already been using that with a lot of patients that I work with one-on-one, that, medical journaling is, the gold standard. I spent hours and hours in my mom's spiral bound medical journals. We have so many of them with all the, I'm speaking to Car, you all know the medical journaling route, and the doctors always love to see it and think it's so helpful. But now we can do it digitally with an app that does it all for you on your phone, and we can just print it out on the back end and send it straight to your doctor with your permission, so that your doctor can also see this health data and can start, acknowledging your long-term symptoms and crash cycle. And it's real data, not just a patient saying, this is what I'm experiencing. And we've, as you all know, patients who report their symptoms tend to not get believed, especially women patients, and especially in this disease space. So this is something that we can do now that both benefits research and the direct patient experience, in that it helps you control your own data, both for your health use and for research use. Yeah, that was a lot as well.
Yeah, I just think it's such a wealth of information with all of this wealth of long COVID interest. So
I
thank
agree.
you for creating it and helping it gets overused.
I will pass that compliment on to the research team. I wish I could have taken credit for creating it, but that was all their amazing work, and they've done an exceptional job, and I'll pass that along. They'll be very happy to hear that.
Thank you.
Thank you. So just really quickly, I just wanted to spend a couple minutes on how all of this applies to you and your advocacy on a day-to-day. So Liz had asked me, and I'm so sorry, this is on me, I forgot to provide it. I meant to provide it before this meeting, with a sample email that you can send to your members of Congress, especially I know you have several new members of Congress in Atlanta or in Georgia to draw upon. And I was going to send you a sample email you can use as just a copy paste, fill in your information, first touch point. So I will definitely get that out, and I'll share that with your leaders to distribute to y'all. So the first thing is deciding what level of advocacy you personally want to exert, right? There's one of the beautiful things about advocacy is we talk about it and everyone sort of immediately thinks of the Capitol building, right? And like out with signs and protests, like that's what people sort of think of when they think of advocacy. But the reality is advocacy is a lot more complex and nuanced than that. Advocacy is you in your doctor's office, fighting for your symptoms to be relieved. That's advocacy. Advocacy is your family, making a point that you have a right to be in a wheelchair, handicap space if someone gives you grief because you don't look sick. All of that is different types of advocacy. And so when I think people get a little gun shy when they hear the word advocacy because they're like, oh, I don't want to be in that confrontational space, right? I don't want to have to be on the front lines with police and yell, or I don't want to have to, fly to DC. All of that seems really intimidating, but it's amazing. Advocacy can be as simple as a phone call or an online petition. So let me talk a little bit more about how our advocacy day works and what you can expect in your energy levels and your activities to be an advocate during Advocacy Week coming up. So first of all, we really do try to make this as easy as possible. So if the first thing you do is you register if you are interested in taking a meeting with your member of Congress. And now keep in mind, this is not just for your own member of Congress. You may be called in to support other advocates and meet with other members either in your area or not in your area. Then also, you may not get a meeting. That's one of the downsides of not going in person, is that we cannot guarantee meetings doing virtual. So it's very possible you might sign up and then when on the 16th, April 16th is when you'll get your personalized email schedule. That'll be emailed out to you directly. And you may get an email schedule that's blank without anybody in it. Let us know if that happens. But the new thing that we have this year that is really, really neat is we actually do have an online system that was designed to be digital. So it's very similar to a kind of a calendaring app. You can put it on your phone, on your tablet, or access it through a website. And but you do have to register in order to participate and get in. So even if you are taking other meetings that are not your own, you still need to register so we can get you in the system. So step one, register. And with that registration, you can expect about 2 hours on average of time commitment. Those 2 hours will consist of first getting trained. So the week before Advocacy Day, which is Tuesday, April 20th. So the week before, which is Tuesday, April 13th, we will have a 1 hour training. We will have it live so that you can ask questions like this. We will also record it so you can watch it on your own time if you're not feeling that well that day. And we will also have three short 10-minute video versions. So if for whatever reason you're not able to do the full hour, we'll have 3 short 10-minute video versions that you can watch as well. So so the first part of Advocacy Day is planned for about an hour of prep work. This prep work involves watching that video to get trained. It also includes, for optional if you want to go the extra mile, practicing your story. I say take about 10 minutes to practice sort of your story and your experience, telling people, tell a friend, to help kind of get comfortable with what you're saying. Especially that moment when you're on the phone with the member of Congress and you start, like, the nerves start playing. It's kind of helpful to have spoken it before and you kind of get into the routine. It all just kind of it feels feel more natural if you said it beforehand. So the second hour of commitment you should anticipate, so it will be a week later. So you should plan for about an hour the week of April 13th to get yourself trained and ready. And then you should plan for about an hour on the day of April 20th to actually take your meetings. Now, what the system is like this year is you will have an email and all you need to do is enter your email. There's no password. It's one login. And it'll bring you into the system, and the system appears almost like a Facebook page where it has your list of meetings in the middle, like a feed with the exact times and dates of all of those meetings and any pending meetings at the bottom, meetings that are not yet confirmed. And so your meetings will be at specific times. They are scheduled to your location so that none of the West Coast people are taking 6 a.m. meetings on the East Coast. It's scheduled to your time zone. You shouldn't have any meetings earlier than 10 a.m. your time, and no meetings later than 4 p.m. your time. So at some point between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. your local time on Tuesday, April 20th, you will then take your calls. We ask that you jump into the system, which is just you enter your email on that computer or on that phone app. There's a link that'll be sent to you. It just pops right up. And then you click the meeting that you're signing in for. If you're, for example, signing in for a 10 a.m. meeting, we ask that you sign in at like 9:55. You click the button of the meeting you're signing in for. It pops into the meeting page. And in that meeting page, it has everything in one place: handouts, a summary of the legislator you're speaking with, the name of everybody else in your group, including the ability to message through the system people in the group, like an instant messaging system. Hopefully, fingers crossed, they're still in development, but by the time we have Advocacy Day next month, they'll also have a group messaging system that you can do inside the app. Do keep in mind that when you message people, it also generates an email for them. So that's why we're trying to get the group messaging system as a set aside, so they're not getting an email every single time you text. But the one-on-one messaging will generate an email every time you message somebody in the one-on-one, and then the group messaging will not. When that should be online by the time we get to your event. So then once you're in that meeting page, again, there's the messaging system, there's the summary, all the downloadable one-pagers are in there. We'll have all your talking points will be in there too, and the list of everybody else in your meeting. And then it won't have their contact information, but some of you may notice on the form this year, we have a new category that says, I give permission to share my contact information. If you do want to share your contact information with your group, you can select that, and then we'll make sure groups have, again, everybody who opted in to have their information shared will have access to contact each other. There's also the Facebook group, which you can coordinate through, which has just been gone live as well for the whole event. So that's, and keep in mind, it is public, so don't share your personal information on there, but it'll now allow you to connect to everybody else across the country who's taking part. There's a little green check-in button right above the meeting. Once you click the green check-in button that you're there, all the call-in information will pop up, and it's either a link to do a Zoom call immediately inside. You just click it, it pops right up on your phone or tablet or PC, or there's a dial-in information if you want to do it by phone as well. And again, you just check in, you hit that green button 5 minutes before your meeting, and all the information appears. So then there's the meeting itself. What do you say? We'll cover a lot more of this in the training, which is why I asked you to keep like an hour the week before of your time and energy available for the training. But the short version is you're going to tell your story. The most powerful thing about our messaging is that it has a real world impact, a human that has been touched by this. And because we as the ME community can speak with such painful authority about what living with a chronic illness can be like and what the financial and life and family impacts are of a disease like this, just talk about that and emphasize that, you know, we're looking at 30% of every person who got COVID-19 in 2020 and this year. That's 28 million people we're almost up to now. 30% of them are going to be sick a year later. Where are they getting help? How are they getting help? Please don't let them have the same experience that we in the ME community have had. Don't let ME community continue to have this experience. You have an opportunity here, an unparalleled opportunity to make a difference. And please do so. And that's it. Tell your story and relate it to what's happening. And then the call to action will be spelled out really, you know, please support HR X923, whatever our bill number is going to be. And if you want to, I know Mina and Elizabeth and Timber have been really great at telling their personal stories in our old hats. Like they do it so well. So you have some great folks here in the Georgia advocacy community that you can work with to help you if you need to tinker with your story and find a way to deliver it. So after you have that, so that's really it. It's about 20 minutes long for each meeting. So you can anticipate about 20 minutes. Depending on the number of people you have with you, you can speak for between 3 to 5 minutes. If there's a lot of people in the group, especially the senator meetings get kind of crowded, you might be reassigned to a different meeting to support. And it's just a really quick conversation. These staff members do these conversations day in, day out. They will make you feel comfortable, make you feel like, you know, heard. But as I just said, they do these things all the time. So the key to, you know, it'll never be uncomfortable. They'll always make sure that you feel, you know, they're never going to be mean. They're never going to be rude. They might push back a little bit, but it'll always be in a professional, courteous way. So you don't need to worry about getting in like some political punching fest with these staffers. They are never going to be like that. But the one thing that they do is, as I mentioned, they do this all day, every day. So it can be a little like, yes, person has problem, take notes. So the key is to make these meetings impactful is to connect with that person, to make your story touch them somehow. I have kind of a secret pathway or a secret sauce into this because I was a staffer. So I can say, hey, I was you. And then my mom got sick and now look at my life. This is you. You watch out. Like I can do that, right? Because I have that immediate connection. But you as a patient, it might be a little bit more challenging to find that connection, but talk with them. This is, oh, you have a daughter? My daughter's that age too. Where did she go to school? Or bring it back to the district. That's another really helpful thing. I went to John Wayne High School. Did you like, is that where your kid went? Or are you familiar with the area? Those kind of questions or interactions are what's good. So I share this because, telling your story is always going to be impactful. You will always make a strong case when you share your personal experiences, speak from your heart. But the best stories are the ones that touch these people, that make them remember. And so that's what you're really going for. You want that emotional impact so that when they're taking those notes come with a feeling and they communicate that feeling either to the member themselves or to their LD to support this. And essentially, in a very mini version, what you're trying to do with these folks is convert them to being an ME/CFS advocate. And you have 20 minutes to do so, and you have 20 minutes to do so using your life story as the mechanism to create that interest. Last but not least, you'll have a little bit of follow-up, which is totally optional. What's new this year, which is really cool, is that messaging system that we told you about inside the platform we have this year. It'll actually pre-generate thank you messages for you. If at the end of the meeting, you can literally just click the button, it'll have a pre-generated message. You can type your customization in and it'll just send. So you don't even have to worry about sending your own thank you messages this year. The system will do it for you. If you choose to go the next mile and you want to send an additional follow-up message, our team will be providing, like we did in the past, sample messages that you can use, but it'll all be in the system this year, so you don't even have to worry about that. Regarding personalized outreach in advance of the meeting, that was one question Mina asked me to address. Since we are working with some of these legislators on appropriations, at this time we ask you not to reach out to your members about the meetings in April. Specifically, but if you want to reach out to your legislators on other issues, for example, hey, there's a $1.9 trillion COVID relief package. Is long COVID going to be in it? That's a good outreach. Or you're mentioning your new legislators. Hi, I'm the ME Action Georgia chapter representative for our district. I'm nice to meet you. I'd love to talk with you in the future about how we can work with your office. Those sort of introductory emails, and those are the ones that I promised to send, and I will. Those are fun things. If you want to talk to them about things, awesome. But we pay a firm that does an amazing job that schedules all of this for you. This year we're working with the wonderful Mary Elizabeth Stinger, who, for those of you who remember 2 years ago, was our point of contact, same team. Really wonderful lady, has a member with a disability in her family, so she's very understanding about our needs. And she's available 24/7. So if you ever need your schedule changed, want to be reassigned to a different group, anything involved in that, simply email Mary Beth. I can put her email in the chat. And don't worry about having to do the scheduling or anything around the meetings. That's all taken care of for you. So for your member outreach, I can give you those draft emails for other things, but if don't worry about having to take care of any of the scheduling. If you have a scheduling conflict or need to change your meeting, again, that's what we're here for. Just let our team know, and we'll get all of that out to you. So I'll pause there. I know I've taken up most of the time, but did anyone have any other questions? I'm happy to stay a little late too, about your specific role in the larger advocacy process.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Yeah, go ahead, Jess.
How are you doing, Jess?
Good to see you, Emily. Thank you so much for being here. My question is there anything that we should be considering, since we have 2 new senators, that we should be specifically focusing on, since they're new and they're not necessarily established? And I don't know, like it's a totally different for us. We're so used to not like bouncing up against a brick wall. Is there anything we should be considering? I guess is my big question.
That's a great question. I had spoken a little bit with your leadership team in advance about, and that's one of the things I promised was an intro email. So that's on me. I owe you guys some resources there. But I would say just the introductory meet and greet is always a good way to go, especially with new members. They're gonna be navigating some new waters, right? And I think one of the pieces, and this is just my opinion, that one of the pieces that I see that doesn't seem to get established with most members until they have a few years under them is understanding the importance of community organizations. I think they're getting better at it now, but in the early phases of a congressional member's career, they just got in, and so it's the immediate rush of, okay, who helped me get here? I owe favors, right, to all these folks. So there's that early rush of kind of everybody who gave to the campaign and that sort of like war chest mentality. And so these freshman members are yet to learn the power of the community organizations like the Solve Emmys or the Long COVID Alliances or the Emmy Actions of the world. And even though these folks can't give politically, cannot give to a war chest, so to say, because we're nonprofits and we can't do that, but we can be incredibly valuable allies on particular issues, resources, leveraging important messages out to larger audiences of voters. So now is that's a long way to say now is a great time to teach them, especially your junior members. Now is a great time to not just do a meet and greet, to demonstrate the value of what working with a community partner can be. So that would be my recommendation in terms of the initial outreach with some of these new folks. Is just, I often use the terminology, how can I be a resource to your office? That kind of framework, like how, if you're learning about this issue, let us teach you, right? If you're unsure about what issue as a junior member you use politically safe, let us teach you. Here's how to talk about this issue and be forthright. I actually had a couple members, where I just straight up said, they're like, well, what about mentioning blah, blah, blah yoga or blah, blah, like, no. Like, let me tell you, exercise is bad. Let me explain why. And it's that level of sort of like, you almost take the maternal or paternal, like, let me put you under my wing, young congressman, and show you the ways of my world. And most staffers are appreciative because they are. I mean, can you imagine being a freshman staffer, fresh out of grad school? You've probably spoken to half dozen real humans that were in the political world in your life, and suddenly you're face to face with an entire 500,000 constituents who all need or different things and care about different things, and it can be overwhelming. So I prefer, and this is my approach. Please take it if it works for you. Feel free to develop your own if you'd rather take a different approach. But I generally take the educational support model with new members, and then that of course is sort of a quid pro quo because a little while down the line I'm going to say, all this time I've been helping you, here's a bill. You need to help me now. So I hope did that answer your question, Jess? I see you're kind of cool. Hope you feel better.
Emily, I feel like this has been phenomenal. Thank you just so much for taking the time. And I really look forward to us really trying to get our group energized and to get more people to participate. But I just thank you so much for laying it all out for us. This has been so good. Does anyone have any last minute things they want to throw in very quickly? We seem to be at about 2:00.
I wanted to ask real quickly, I know that there's a whole system for setting up the meetings that you have there. Is there any way to be sure that our 2 new senators and the 2 new Congress people in our area get particularly strong teams together? If there's any way to emphasize that to the people who are forming the teams, I would like to do that.
That is a great question. Thank you, Wilhelmina. So we are limited. We can only ask for a meeting for districts in which we have a participant who lives in that district or is representing someone who lives in that district. So, so if there's a member that you really want to meet with, doesn't even necessarily have to be a Georgia member, find someone in that district and make sure they register. Because or ask someone who lives in that district if you have their permission to represent on their behalf, and then you can join and represent them. So, for example, I haven't been to. Oh, my brother has a lot of symptoms of ME/CFS. He's in a clinical trial for early onset Parkinson's, and he's been really sick, and he lives in an area in Washington So I always put his address and I always represent him. And even though like half the time my mom's able to represent herself, so the times she's too sick, I'll put in her address as well. But for example, my brother and my mother, I represent them and put in their addresses, even though I live in California and I don't live in those districts. So again, that's the big. I want to emphasize: we cannot ask for a meeting if we don't have a participant from that district. So that's one of the great things that you as a team can do, especially at a state level, is ensure that you have somebody from every district registered. And I can work with your team members. I got access to all the lists on the back end. I can tell you exactly which districts are missing. And then you guys can work internally to find, either someone who's willing to be represented or somebody who wants to join up from those key districts.
Emily,
That's
when you
great.
get in
That's
touch
great.
with
Thank
us,
you.
when you get in touch with us with those email templates, will you go ahead and let us know which districts are not represented and let us make sure that we can start early and try to find people in those districts?
I will add that to my I'm so old school, I still actually do pen and paper. So I'm writing it down right now.
That would be terrific. Thank you.
No problem. And right now, let's see, I think we had 173 people registered last I looked, and our goal this year is 400 people. So we're nearly halfway there.
Registration
Registration
is
is
open.
open.
Okay.
It is. You can get to the website. It's www.meadvocacyweek.com. I'll put that in the chat too. Or I can also just put in the registration form directly in there as well. If you just do not want to pass go, just go straight to the actual registration page. Let me get that.
I had a question after when that isn't completely, but it's about stuff we've brought up. But if anybody else wants to focus on the advocacy week right now, I will ask my question later. Nope.
Go ahead, Timber.
Okay. So about the focus on funding medical education and clinical care, there's this current proliferation of long COVID clinics in every state, everywhere, and they're unregulated. There's no guidance. Everybody's recreating the wheel. They're all PT based.
Mm-hmm.
And they're obviously very few are differentiating PEM in their populations, and they're throwing exercise at things and seeing if it works.
Yeah.
So I have two questions. Is this something that our Congress people and the NIH are going to think of as part of the groundwork that's already being laid for clinical care for long COVID and the post-viral needs of our country? And is Solve trying to have any communication with these clinics or have any advocacy related to having this be an effective model instead of a potentially insanely damaging model?
Absolutely. So, okay, there's a lot there. Let me. No, it's a good question though. It's a challenge, and this has been. I'll start by saying this is not a challenge that is unique to long COVID. I think the attention and money and resources and interest in long COVID is making this particularly an acute challenge now, but it's definitely not new. We struggled with this all in the ME/CFS space. We would have doctors approach us all the time and say, "Can you put us on your website? We're ME/CFS experts." And I'd be like, "Okay, what's your ME/CFS expertise?" They're like, "Oh, we're physical therapy or whatever," and it was like, ah. So, and that's one of the reasons we've always wrestled with whether or not to put like AIMS does, the American ME/CFS group has that Yelp review style thing where they just put anybody can submit a doctor and they can be on there. And we've wrestled with it. We ultimately always decide not to do it because the idea of differentiating who is a good provider versus who is a bad provider is so hard to manage. So at the federal level, with your question specifically, it's kind of the same challenge in a slightly different flavor. How do you, designate a good post-COVID clinic versus a bad post-COVID clinic? How can you invest in clinics that are only promoting healthy treatment models, and right now there's no treatment models out there for long COVID, right? You can't even, at least with ME/CFS, we have the primer and a couple other, key resources, but with long COVID, that doesn't even exist. So it's not easy. And I just share this as an example of one of the many complexities about why it's not really the role of federal government typically to come in at the care provision level. It's very rare for the federal government to do that. Even on the medical education side, there are very few items that outside of like HIV, AIDS, and a couple other core elements that are federally required education for doctors. It's sort of most of it is controlled at the state level. So that's one element is I think a lot of these COVID clinics I think are going to end up being sort of state challenges as opposed to federal challenges. That's part one. Part two is looking at the federal research dollars. And so that's where we see, we can't do very much with our size about, double checking or vetting every post clinic or MECFS clinic out there. We just don't have the resources to do that. But what we can do is we can tell the leaders at the federal government who are at the decision tables in those regards what needs to be done or what should be done. So, for example, with our work at the NIH, specifically through the Long COVID Alliance, we've made specific guidance about, certain types of treatment recommendations that we think should be pursued and certain types that we think should not be pursued. And so that'll be in their minds as they decide who gets federal funding, so we can help guide in that sense. We can kind of put our fingers on the hand of the guiding invisible hand of the federal government investments and sort of nudge it where we think it needs to go. That's one aspect. The last element you brought up regarding what we can do to educate them and are we reaching out to them? So I'll be honest, again, it's kind of a capacity issue. We don't really have, we sort of take a more positive approach because we just don't have the resources to chase down everyone who's doing bad work. But what we do is we try to track down and partner with people who are doing good work. So there are a couple post-COVID clinics that we've aligned with that we've, they're registration sites for the registry. They're starting to use the app. We've done some certain partnerships with things like that. But we only sort of find the good ones that like have, for one way or another, kind of bubbled up in our attention as good clinics that are addressing MECFS, that are aware that GT and CBT are not positive treatments, that are looking at more, effective interventions. That's kind of our way of doing it. Instead of kind of just seek out and smack down the bad, there's just too many. We sort of seek out and rise up the good. That's and I wish we had more resources, or else I would love the capacity to go and chase down everybody who's providing bad services and hurting people. But we're just not there yet. Someday, maybe. I'm sorry. I think there was a third piece of your question. Did I answer all of it? Okay, good.
Y'all, I think this has just been phenomenal. We are past 2:00, and so I'm going to suggest we wrap it up now. But Emily, just cannot thank you enough for coming to talk to us, giving us a little inspiration. And we really look forward to just getting more people involved in this, getting as many people from Georgia to participate as possible. And thank you so much for giving us these tools and your expertise. We're just so grateful to you.
Thank you. And again, big kudos to Georgia all around. Keep up the great work. And you have a wonderful, amazing leadership team at ME Action Georgia. Don't be afraid to reach out to them, to use them, to work with these folks. These are folks who are giving their time and energy to make an impact. And we're all in this together. So thank you all for what energy and time you're able to give. And if you're able to give more, we always have more use for you. Let us know. And we'll keep. And the last thing I just wanted to mention really quickly before I sign off is if there are anybody who is an experienced advocate who is interested in being a sub, please let me know because we are trying to put together a sub list of people who can jump in, who are available in case there's some last minute dropouts for people who are too sick last minute to attend. So, so if you're planning on being available and you have the energy and time, please let me know if you're interested in being on our sub list to jump in for people who may last minute be too sick.
Great. All right. Thank you all so much for being here. Everybody go rest. Emily, grateful. Thank you
Thanks,
so
everyone.
much.
Thanks, Emily. This was great.
Thank you so much.
Scott, I guess if you're still here, if you'll stop the recording.